Today I'm going to walk you through how I made these pumpkin bags. They've got little like ridges, like a real pumpkin would, but are otherwise fairly impressionist, I suppose. I used reclaimed fabrics. I think both the orange and the brown that I used for the lining were old curtains. The handle is intentionally all twisted up, just like the vine of a pumpkin might be. And these will be great trick-or-treat bags for my littles. I used two different approaches for these bags. For this one, I sewed all the main pieces together, and then I sewed all the lining pieces together, and I lined them up and attached them by sewing along the seams so that it created these little pockets for the stuffing. For this one, I took a similar approach, but I did each half separately. So I sewed 3 main pieces together and 3 lining pieces together, and then sewed along those seam lines. The advantage with this second approach is that it was a lot easier to maneuver in the machine and sew all the way down the seam line. With the first approach where I sewed the whole main and the whole lining together, I couldn't sew that seam line all the way down to the bottom. I just couldn't get it into the machine. So it's only like 3/4 of the way down, but I think that's okay. Maybe over time the stuffing will kind of fall in and around, but I kind of feel like it will more likely want to stay where it is. And the disadvantage with this second approach, where I did half and half and was able to sew all the way down to the bottom and create like true pockets all the way down, is that the part where all the pieces meet up was just a little messier. I ended up going back in with a hand needle and thread and kind of cleaning that up a little bit. So today I'm going to cover the second approach where we're sewing the two halves separately and then combining them, because I think it's a little easier to maneuver and get a more professional finish, but I'm honestly happy with how both turned out, so either approach could work. My shape is essentially a flattened 2D football with the top quarter-ish cut off. The widest part, which is about 2/3 up of our decapitated football, is 4 inches because I want the finished circumference to be 24 inches and I'm going to have 6 panels. 6 times 4 is 24. You could make whatever circumference you want, just divide that by 6 to determine the width of your pattern. The height is 9 inches because I want it to be about 6 inches tall and accounted for about 3 inches eventually acting as the bottom. I used 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. You'll need 6 of these in your lining fabric and 6 in your main fabric, but my main fabric is a really wide weave that is pretty transparent, so I decided to cut an additional 6 in my lining fabric and use that as a backing for each of my main pieces. To assemble, first I backed each of my main pieces with that extra lining piece using my serger. Then I sewed 3 of my main pieces together along the long sides and 3 of my lining pieces together along the long sides. I then pressed all my seams open. If you wanted to add a jack-o'-lantern face, now is the time to do that. I just cut eyes and a mouth and top stitched them to my 3 main pieces with a zigzag stitch. Next, I lined up the 3 main pieces and the 3 lining pieces, wrong sides facing, and top stitch along the seam lines. Ideally, the stitches fall right in the seam of the main and the lining piece. This is what makes this approach a bit easier. If we had sewn all the main pieces together and all the lining pieces together first, it'd be a lot harder to maneuver the pieces in the machine and get all the stitches to line up. I skipped stitching over my jack-o'-lantern features so that there wouldn't be a seam line across them. Then repeat this with the remaining 3 main pieces and the remaining 3 lining pieces. Now we have 2 halves. To sew these together, we'll sew 2 of the main pieces right sides together, then the corresponding 2 lining pieces right sides together. You may have to kind of awkwardly stuff the bag within itself, but it shouldn't be too challenging. Now we'll top stitch that new seam just like we did with the others. Finally, we'll close up the bag by sewing the remaining main pieces together, right sides together, and sewing the remaining lining pieces together, again right sides together. Then we'll top stitch that final seam. I used a needle and thread to clean up the bottom where all the main pieces meet and where all the lining pieces meet. Then I stuffed each of the 6 pockets formed between the lining and the main pieces. For the handle, I took advantage of an existing hem on my lining fabric. I cut a long, skinny rectangle around it and attached some interfacing. I then folded it in so the long, raw edge was tucked under the existing finished hem and top stitched that down. To attach the handle to the bag and finish everything, I pinned bias tape along the edge, right sides facing the right sides of my main fabric. At two opposite points, I slid my handle under the bias tape. I then sewed the bias tape in place, catching both the main and the lining fabric all the way around except for where those handles were in place. In those sections, I kind of pulled the lining out of the way so that it wouldn't get stitched and I could slip the end of the handle in between the lining and the main when I flipped the bias tape over. I sewed until about an inch on either side of where the bias tape should meet. Then I clipped to mark where those two ends connect and sewed them right sides together. I then secured that final bit of bias tape to the bag. Finally, I flipped the bias tape over and sewed it in place all the way around. Ta-da! There you have it. Happy haunting. Ooh. Ooh.